This is the Westminster Standard Podcast. I'm Ryan Beasy. Welcome. Today I'm joined again by teaching elder Zach Groff of PCA Polity and the Reverend Joseph Yerger, a pastor in the Evangelical Presbyterian Church at Mansfield First Presbyterian. Welcome, brothers. Thanks for being on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Ryan. Always great to be here on the Westminster Standard Podcast.
Always great to have you. Joseph, since this is your first time on the podcast, would you give us a brief background? How did you come to the Reformed faith? I know your dad was a pastor, and where are you ministering now? Tell us your authentically broken faith journey, briefly.
Certainly. I am a second generation, second career Presbyterian pastor. And before coming into ministry, I spent about 15 years in retail and management before I reached my own personal point of desperation. And, I had done church, I had been a part of it, but before I finally realized that this was what I most needed Jesus. And for me, it was actually a sermon on Matthew 11, 28 to 40, the yoke passage or to 30, that really, that's when I knew that I had to get out of retail and on in. I was raised up in the PC USA where my father was a pastor, but I was originally ordained in ECO, where my father's ordination is presently held. He is currently in the status of honorably retired. So he is out of active vocational ministry. But soon after being ordained, I began to move closer, and with a shift in call, I came over to the EPC, constantly taking steps further and further to the right. I did my Master of Divinity at Gordon Conwell at their Jacksonville, Florida campus. So I had a lot of professors actually coming up from RTS who were serving as adjuncts there. And I'm presently a D-Min candidate at Ashland Theological Seminary in their Biblical Interpretation and Culture doctorate program. My first call was spending 2 years as a prison chaplain down in Florida at a state institution at a maximum security prison. And I am soon ending my fourth year here at Mansfield First Presbyterian in Mansfield, Ohio.
Wonderful. Well, we praise God for how he works out, brings us to himself and equips us for his service. So you're pastor there at a church that has left the EPC. I know your credentials are still there, but sort of in a associate status. But before we get to that aspect of the story, news of a St. Louis congregation petitioning for membership in the EPC has proven to be divisive in that community. And I think that was part of the reason why you and your congregation or are seeking to leave. Why is this particular congregation, Memorial Church in St. Louis, so problematic, as you would explain it?
Well, first and foremost, for exactly who and what they represent, the whole Side B debacle, which caused them to leave the PCA eventually, but also because of the greater and further issues that the desire and attempt to bring them into the EPC has brought out and are showing within the EPC system. So it's actually as great of a problem as Side B theology is, and how terrible it would be to allow that on in. This, I think, is really a symptom of a greater problem within the EPC. And that's what has led us to actually leave.
So you would say it's not just the St. Louis theology, the sodomite lust being okay, as long as you don't act on it, but it's also the polity aspect of how this is happening. It's not only what is happening, but how what is happening is happening. Would that be a fair thing to say?
With one correction, it's by the neglect or abuse of polity that's allowing things to happen, rather than following the rules.
Rules are important.
Because if the rules were being followed, none of this would have actually been happening at this point.
Yes. So in your view, things aren't being done decently and in order. I read that in a book somewhere one time.
I think they're being done decently, but I would say certainly not in order.
As you
The
would
EPC
describe it.
prides itself on being very decent and winsome.
Okay, but so there's a lack of order, as you
There
see it.
is.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, you tried in your own presbytery to affirm or to agree with an overture from New River Presbytery, which is another EPC Presbyterian. I think this overture was based on something that passed the PCA General Assembly, that men and women who identify as homosexual, even those who identify as homosexual and claim to practice celibacy in that self-identification, are disqualified from holding office in the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. How was this overture received, which your session sent up to, was it the Presbytery of the Alleghenies?
Correct. We were a member of the Presbytery of the Alleghenies. So, based off of EPC polity, first and foremost, in order to send a overture that amends the Constitution, it has to be received by the stated clerk 60 days before the General Assembly at which it would be discussed. And so New River passed their overture unanimously early on in February of 2024. And that's when the whole news about the issues at all became broadly public. This was the first instance where something related to this became publicly known in the EPC. My congregation, um, back in 2012 through 2014 or so, left the PCUSA because of these kind of issues. And so when my session found out about this, I had been keeping them abreast over the rumors that I was hearing, but once there was something actionable, they decided we wanted to concur or agree with this overture and try and build as much support for them as we could. And so, because the Presbytery of the Alleghenies has the standing practice that overtures receive two readings, an introduction and then a second time when they would be debated and voted upon, our only option was to do a concurrence rather than sending up the same overture. So we could just set up an overture saying, we're going to agree with this, and not send the overture itself, because the second meeting would be happening in May and would have only been about 30 days prior to General Assembly.
I see. So it seems like a very anodyne proposition, right? If you're experiencing sodomite lust, there's not a path to ordination for you in the church. Doesn't mean you can't be a Christian, but there are certain vile affections, unnatural sins of an unnatural nature that should not be part of the Christian experience of an officer. Seems to be what this overture's design is. So how was that received? As I understand it from the minutes of Presbyterian Allegheny, some people wanted to go on record as opposing the this overture. Is that common in
As
the
opposing
EPC?
even the receipt, of opposing the presbytery accepting the overture, which was sent by my session, as well as by another session in the presbytery. So effectively, we had a motion made and a motion seconded that people were wanting to not even talk about.
Not even. So this wasn't just we don't want to concur. This was we don't even want to talk about this.
Right. We don't even want to bring this issue on up. So
Wow.
they were trying to stop it in its tracks at the very beginning.
Well,
That did not pass, of course.
Okay.
So it was received because honestly, it's really hard to not receive a motion or overture coming on in.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
I could imagine having a communication from an individual or even a church body that doesn't have standing and have an orderly attempt to keep said communication from being included in the docket or recorded on the minutes. But an overture from a member church of the presbytery, I don't see how anyone could conceivably argue against receiving it to be considered. I mean, that's a basic fundamental right of any member of a court or any subordinate court to a higher court. I mean, the whole issue in Acts 15 that sets this precedent for presbyteries and general assemblies is that if a local church has an issue it's trying to work out and needs to bring it to the regional body or the national body, it has a right to do that.
Yeah. The only interpretation I can make off of somebody opposing receipt of something is if they honestly just don't want it to be talked about or brought up.
Well, that doesn't sound very decent.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, that sounds like, I don't know, Stalin or something.
but your presbytery did receive this and did end up concurring with the overture from New River Presbytery. Is that right?
No, we
No.
did receive it, and then I was allowed to introduce the overture in February at the meeting of last year. It
Hmm.
was, and that was the end of the story for the time.
Because it's a
Then
first
we
reading.
come to May when it would be have the opportunity for discussion. That's when it was brought up again. It was introduced by the pastor of the other congregation that sent the overture on up. And that is when the polity issues and the abuse, or at least the things that I certainly disagree with, and I still believe I am more right in this, um, where those things started to occur.
Hmm. Wow. Well, that certainly is curious. Now, the overture did make its way via New River down to the assembly, so that's good. Um, I wonder though, is there an awareness in the Evangelical Presbyterian Church of the allegations against Johnson and the other pastors at Memorial? It wasn't just teaching out of Johnson that there were allegations of impropriety and uh, theological impropriety there that prompted their departure. Is that known in the EPC? What's the narrative about what this church is and what they bring to the EPC?
So I don't recall ever hearing public mention of any of the other staff at Memorial.
Okay.
Um, in all of my communications and everything that I was involved with, I always endeavored to keep the whole idea of actual Memorial and, Johnson out of the conversation, because once you bring them into it specifically,
Sure.
then the issue becomes and feels
Personal.
personal.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that publicly, once things started coming up, that's what began to happen. It
Hmm.
began to be made personal about him. Across the broad EPC, um, I can't say that there is any specific narrative for or against Greg Johnson. I know that many of our folks don't even pay attention to what's going on in our sibling denominations. Some do, many don't. There's a lot of a ethos of a focus on paying attention to your local ministry and don't worry about what's going on around us. And so when New River passed their overture first in February, um, the only thing that started happening were several other overtures began to be passed by other presbyteries in response to New Rivers, in response and opposition to what they were trying to do. And so even at General Assembly, there wasn't any real substantive discussion over
Hmm.
Greg Johnson or the issues surrounding Memorial. But the main talking point that kept on coming up was that he was never he did not leave the PCA with active charges against him, and that he was not under any actual sanction.
Hmm.
Which, if you had been paying attention to things and following the narrative that was happening and surrounding his all of his story, um, it's very clear that he got out of Dodge before they tarred and feathered him and ran him out on a rail.
Well, yeah, that is an interesting narrative that you've conveyed there that doesn't seem to align even with the letter. Now, this letter portion of it that I have on screen is from the Memorial Presbyterian Church session when they were a PCA congregation. And they acknowledged that there were allegations not only against Greg Johnson, but also some of the associate ministers there at the church. And they said, we've got to leave before these allegations that have been received by Presbytery are investigated and turned into charges. Because there's a difference between an allegation and a charge in a judicial sense, polity-wise, right, Zach?
Yeah, yeah. An allegation is basically a report concerning someone's Christian character that triggers a preliminary investigation, typically by a committee of presbytery, that then can yield either the raising of a strong presumption of guilt or the determination that there isn't a strong presumption of guilt. And if such presumption is raised, then we kick off or institute the process, the judicial process, during which somebody could not be transferred, at least not as per our polity. I mean, there's some argument as to whether or not a man can renounce jurisdiction anytime and effectively excommunicate himself. But typically, even that, we'd follow through the process to find a charge of contumacy. And, we're getting into the weeds. But yeah, the way Ryan presented it. Now, something that's curious to me here, and don't let me take us down a rabbit trail, but you, Joseph, you've presented very helpfully to us the EPC's position as you understand it, or at least some within the EPC, is they defend even considering bringing Memorial in. Like, well, they're eligible. There's nothing holding them back. Okay, that's what I would call a negative argument, as in there's no reason not to here. But what would be the positive argument? What good would Memorial Pres, Greg Johnson, et al. Bring into the EPC? Have you heard any positive arguments from anybody within the EPC for why you should bring them in, as opposed to just why you shouldn't not bring them in?
The only thing I can say substantively in regards to that is that the main positive is to rescue Johnson and Memorial and Company, to give them back to a church home. During the limited discussion that surrounded the overture at General Assembly and the limited conversation about it, because the receipt of a pastor and a congregation is something that all takes place at the presbytery level. And similar to the PCA, the state of Missouri is a single presbytery in the EPC. That's Mid-America. And from my understanding, a good number of those folks also went through covenant and were closely aligned, sharing a lot of similarities with the corresponding presbytery. But I can't speak to their discussions, debates, or their opinions on why they should continue to consider and accept him. It's just, I'm aware that they had been in conversation with him since at least the beginning of 2023, soon after he left the PCA. So I have heard no qualitative or substantive arguments in favor of bringing him, because I've just not been in a place where that conversation has happened.
And that's interesting, and a great point that you bring up, Zach. Why would you want to do this? Right? There's arguments why not to do something, but why would you? And sort of, what do you have to live for? Why? What are they going to bring to the EPC? And Memorial, when it was a member of the PCA, they had an interesting relationship with their presbytery. One of the other letters that they sent is that the regional presbytery was supportive to a large extent, but that with the increasing awareness of Greg Johnson's views, the increasing awareness of what was going on at Memorial in their chapel. I mean, I know my presbytery sent up alarming letters of alarm, not just letters of concern, to Missouri Presbytery, asking them to investigate Not Greg Johnson, the presbytery didn't, but asking Missouri Presbytery to investigate the session as a whole into how transvestite conferences and performers were allowed to peddle their wares in church property with the hospitality of Memorial Pres. Even providing drinks, that the congregation is providing booze for these people.
I'd say
Uh,
it's beyond hospitality, Ryan. I mean, they were subsidizing what any reasonable biblical Christian should be able to recognize is utterly abhorrent
yeah,
to the Lord God Almighty who made them male and female.
I mean,
I mean, it's
dishonoring the
just
bodies among themselves.
and jeopardizing the rest of the denomination.
Yeah,
For example, I'm in a little church with a I'm in a little church with a delightful country chapel here. Nothing extravagant, very humble. But if if an activist theater group came in and said, we'd like to rent your facility for a for one of our productions, and the production, featured a narrative about a transvestite or transgender man that is a biological female, we might say, seeking to, quote, transition into being a man, taking testosterone shots. And my session said, no, we're not going to do that. But then we turned around and said, yes, we'll have a production of You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, put on by a school group. Well, then there's a lawsuit, a discrimination lawsuit. And so, and in that lawsuit, perhaps they would be able to bring in at least reports of a PCA church hosting such events, which is precisely what happened at the chapel, the performance venue attached to Memorial Church. And it's just scandalous. And then you see like the advertisements for this stuff, and you think, oh my goodness, this is just outrageous and disgusting
yeah. I couldn't
by any
show
standard.
the advertisements on. I mean, we would probably be censored by YouTube if we showed the advertisements for them. I mean, they're in the Tennessee Valley Presbytery Minutes because we attached that letter, but I couldn't show them here. This is
Yeah,
of what
I
was
don't want to
happening.
see him. I don't want to see him. I wrote
I
on this
didn't
for
want to see.
Reformation. I wrote on this issue for Reformation 21. So did Todd Pruitt for the Mortification of Spin
And
kind
there
of
was some
platform.
pixelation of
Yeah, we had to. It's just it was absolutely stunning. I mean, it blindsided us. Like who could have conceived of a PCA church? I mean, if a national denomination is right wing coded, I mean the PCA is. Who could have conceived of that taking
mm,
place on the grounds of a PCA church, and not just taking place like by accident or under the radar, but being celebrated and advertised and subsidized, and then with volunteers from. I mean, it's like sending the sheep into a den of wolves. I mean, it was just absolutely insane.
yeah.
How do you avoid the appearance of support and endorsement?
Well, you certainly don't avoid that by providing food and drinks for them while their plays are going on. Now,
Yeah,
Missouri Presbytery did adopt some guidelines before some of the most egregious
yep.
violations took
Before the
place.
Transluminate
Well, I think this may
production
have
is what
been
it was.
after the Transluminate.
It was. I thought this was just after. Wasn't this just after Revoice, but before Transluminate became well known? I don't know.
Yeah, well, this was the summer of 2020. They established some things that the memorial session was required to do. And you see them there on the screen. Establish accountability for the chapel ministry. Create clearer processes to intentionally curate the art platform in the chapel. Strengthen the leadership of the ministry by developing more robust advisory board that reports to the church officers, and then rearticulate the vision and mission of the chapel with greater clarity. And that's an interesting one there, Zach. When the presbytery says to the session, you need to rearticulate your vision and ministry, your vision and mission of this particular ministry. That's Missouri Presbytery exercising good review and control, wouldn't you say?
I think Missouri Presbytery did really. I mean, there are areas where I would have wished to see something a bit more decisive or move more quickly. But
Yeah,
I
of
think
course.
Missouri Presbytery actually did a fantastic job in many of its communications, I've written that publicly, and this is one area where they really did give Memorial Presbyterian Church, at the time Presbyterian, every opportunity to change course. Every opportunity to change course. And that wasn't just because, their buddies or whatever trying to buy time or whatever. I really think this was a sincere effort to reclaim errant brothers from a course of destruction, which I really hope doesn't get dragged into the EPC.
Yeah. Yeah. So this
And
was
so I
20.
commend Missouri Presbytery.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
I think I
for the way
commended
they-
them publicly as well. And I've defended the PCA based on the actions of Missouri Presbytery when people to say quote unquote our right mock us and try to claim that we didn't do anything. I'm like, no, we did things decently and in order, giving every opportunity we possibly could for repentance without backing down. And and Memorial saw what was going on, and they, like we've used this phrase, left Dodge, got out of town.
And so that was 2020, and then in 2021 or 2022, they had El Draco, the dragon, a drag performer coming in, and then in October of 2022, they send this letter saying, well, the perceived controversy surrounding
actual controversy. This church was and its session was disturbing the peace and the purity of the church. Their own local expression of the church, their regional expression of the church, there's Missouri Presbytery, and of course our denominational expression, our national church, the Presbyterian Church in America. I mean, how can you claim to be faithful to the Scriptures, true to the Reformed faith, and obedient to the Great Commission while doing this stuff? I mean, it's just insane. Yeah. And we got to keep on fighting against it because we live in a world where it hasn't gone away yet.
Right. I mean, side B is. I know we've made a lot of progress, but side B is still alive in the PCA and maybe Missouri Presbytery too, which we may discuss at a later time. But so Joseph, you proposed this change to your constitution along with New River, and so you believe it's necessary to keep guys like Johnson, but not just Johnson, but all of the drama that is associated with this predilection, this sin pattern, but also to spare the EPC, the rancor that plagued Missouri Presbytery and the PCA trying to deal with that particular session.
100%.
So why then? And this is going into the issues of why, because the arguments that I hear, well, homosexual lust is just like any other lust. Why is it unlawful? Why is it problematic? Someone who just experiences sodomite lust. Why is that in itself different than experiencing natural lust?
So Scripture, best place to start with things. 1 John 5:16-17, shows us that there is a hierarchy to sin. Not all sins are created equal, even though every sin is deserving of God's condemnation, wrath, and judgment. Every sin deserves death, but some sins are worse than others. Larger Catechism 150, 151 goes into length talking about what makes a sin more grievous than any other. And when you start talking about, that heterosexual lust and homosexual lust are morally equivalent, what you're really talking about here is an egalitarianization of sin. That all sin is equal because all sins deserve the same punishment. And that is a broad sense out of modern evangelicalism, which I think we can probably trace back through neo-orthodoxy and Karl Barth and Bonhoeffer and all the mess that we went through during the 20th century. And so when you say that all sins are equal, then yes, if they're morally equivalent, then there would be no block against refusing that, because arguments are made about somebody who identifies as an alcoholic. Would they be prohibited? I would actually argue yes by the identification, rather than, because it denies sanctification, transformative power of the Holy Spirit, and the change that Christ can and will work within a person in His mercy.
That's
Um,
can I interrupt you there?
Please.
I want to probe that what you just said about an alcoholic, because a lot in our society are acquainted with the Alcoholics Anonymous mantra. Hello, my name is Ryan, and I'm an alcoholic. Now that's going to get
Mhm.
clipped, I'm sure. Um, uh, but a Christian, Alcoholics Anonymous is spiritual, but it's not a Christian organization, because a Christian would say you ought not consider yourself an alcoholic for the rest of your life. That you're in Christ, you are striving to overcome that alcoholism. That you're not in bondage to alcoholism for the rest of your life. That you can even enjoy the fruit of the vine, especially at the Lord's table, with freedom and moderation and holiness. Is that fair to say, or am I just some extreme PCA guy?
Nope, nope. You are absolutely right with that. I'm not a fan of Rick Warren, but the work he did with Celebrate Recovery, I've known several people who've gone through the program. It was something we were actually getting ready to try and offer at the prison, in addition to the Alcoholics Anonymous. It is rooted in the gospel, as well with the hope and change and transformation that Christ will bring, so that someday you would not say that you are an alcoholic. A Christian who identifies himself with his sin and by his sin is denying his identity in Christ. Christ plus anything is Christless.
Uh, yes, yes. Let me ask you this. So, someone who says to an exam committee, for example, in my past, I've struggled with alcoholism, but I haven't overindulged in years. Um, would you say that person is probably on that regard not barred from office?
After a few more additional probing questions and getting more information, probably they are
Okay.
certainly eligible for consideration.
And now let me ask you this: someone who said, "In my past, I have experienced sodomite lust, but that is not a part of my experience now." Maybe he's married, maybe he's got a couple of kids and a wife. Uh, would such a person who simply confesses to having experienced sodomite lust in the past, but is no longer um, plagued and in bondage to that particular lust, would that person be eligible for ordination?
Eligible for consideration. I would leave that up to
Sure.
the ordaining bodies,
Yes,
their examination, and the specific circumstances.
but not
But
not
somebody
disqualified.
who, you know, confesses their sin,
Yeah,
who repudiates and repents of that sin, is actively working against it, mortifying it, and is claiming to have exhibited success with that, um, is certainly eligible for
for
consideration.
consideration. But someone who, and Zach, feel free to chime in here. Someone who um, says, I currently experience sodomite lust, and it is a regular, ongoing occurrence that would that person be ineligible,
A
even if he
person
doesn't
who
act on it?
a person who would say, "I suffer from homosexual lust, and I am a homosexual. I'm not going to do it, but I am a homosexual, and this is how I am." I would say is not eligible even for consideration. They have disqualified themselves because this goes back to the earlier question where we interrupted. As Jesus shows during the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, even the desire and inclination of sin, such as hating your brother or having lustful thoughts, is the same as sinning itself. It is sin. Then somebody who is exhibiting that lust or experiencing that lust, they are sinning, whether it is homosexual lust or heterosexual lust. And where the difference comes that makes the homosexual lust more grievous is because it goes against the created order. Heterosexual desire is something that is good, which God has given to us for the marital relationship, between a man and a woman. That is a good. Heterosexual lust outside of the bonds of marriage is a sin. We all would agree with that. Homosexual lust, on the other hand, is never a good. It is not given to us by God for any particular relationship or good or value. And so all homosexual lust is intrinsically wicked and sinful and worse because it goes against the created order. One is a disordered desire, something that is good that is taken bad. And homosexual lust is something that is bad that only gets worse from there.
Mm. So it's the quality of the sin, that there's no lawful output for sodomite lust, whereas heterosexual lust has a lawful output in marriage, right? As the Apostle Paul says, it's better to marry than to burn.
Than to burn.
And one of his double entendres there, I'm sure. Um, so, Zach, before we move on, do you have anything you want to ask or to follow up on?
You know, one argument against what we're saying here is that we're driving people back into the closet, where a guy's gonna hide this desire that he has when he comes before us for membership interviews, for officer candidate interviews and examinations, or what have you. And I want to remark that even now, the guys who have these feelings, have these desires, experience this lust that we've denominated sodomite lust, homosexual lust, and desire, same-sex sexual attraction, side B, gay Christianity, whatever. When they tell us in interviews, I'm thankful for their honesty. I'll tell you what. Even as I stand with you and I would say to the guy, brother, if he has a credible profession of faith otherwise, I'd say, brother, thank you for being honest. And it pains me to say that at this point in time, you are not qualified to pursue the ministry any further, unless and until the Lord frees you from this besetting sin of disorder, of disordered affections, and of deviant desires, even animalistic desires. Don't pursue the ministry. And I've used this illustration before. If a man said, such as a New York Times op-ed piece just this week, absolutely outrageous, but if a man said that he experienced sexual attraction to minors and to children, but he didn't act on it, and he's fighting against it, would we not tell him not to pursue the ministry? Would we not indeed forbid him from pursuing the ministry in our ranks? Of course we would forbid him, even if we thanked him for being honest, as we're disgusted by what he said. We would say, you have no business being in a position of authority in any organization or community or group that involves children, much less the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ. And then we would, we'd have to get creative about figuring out how to minister to him and involve him in the life of the church. Probably find a congregation that doesn't have children around or something like that. I know that's what one of our colleagues has recommended. I think that's a good common sense recommendation. And or if a guy came to us and said, I've experienced and I continue to experience sexual attraction toward and fill in the blank, lamps, amusement park rides, animals, whatever. You think it's ridiculous, but there are instances of each of these that have been covered by mainstream news.
Well,
And
and
so we know it's
pornography
out there.
has warped people's minds
It
and
has. It
affections.
has.
And so it sounds absurd, but that's what this does.
Yeah,
Pornography does that.
it does. It does. And that's the whole purpose of it, is to warp the culture and the minds of those who make up the culture, and to basically defile that which is noble and good in human society. Now, I will say this too, because we always offer hope. We believe that this is not a psychosis or a neurosis or a mania. We believe this is a sin problem. And because it's a sin problem, it can be addressed, and you can change. The Lord can renew you and regenerate you and change your desires. And He does. He does precisely that. We've all experienced. There were things that we desired and lusted after, you might call ordered or disordered, whatever the case may be, before we were converted, that in time or even at our conversion, God radically changed. And by His Spirit, He continues to change our hearts and to make us more Christ-like. And so there's hope. There's hope for the afflicted sinner. There's hope for for each and every one of us. And we mustn't ever talk about this without offering that hope and reminding our listeners who might experience such affections and desires to their chagrin and to their great dismay. We should remind them that though there's a chorus of voices that tell you, you will never change, indeed, there is one voice that matters, God's voice, who says, I will make all things new. And we need to remember that.
Amen.
Amen. Yes, and that seems to be what is so tragic about this discussion, Zach, is that if we're admitting people to church office
Mm-hmm.
who don't believe that there's change, who will say on the floor of General Assembly, I've talked to every ministry and nobody can change. That is depriving people of hope. I think the book that Dr. Johnson wrote, Still Time to Care, it was remarked that that's not gospel care. It's palliative care. It's hospice, spiritual hospice care, just letting people die in their unnatural lusts rather than calling them to the life of Christ, which is what the ministry is all about. It's our joy and our delight to call people to freedom. So
Amen.
changing gears here, as this overture made its way to the EPC General Assembly, um, how how did it fare? What was debate like at the assembly? It sounds like the Judicial Review Committee tried to rule it unconstitutional. What was that like? I know we've got a video here from teaching elder Jeremiah. Let me know when you're ready for that.
So the process when we got to General Assembly, um, one of the duties and responsibilities of the stated clerk is to set the agenda, setting the order of discussion and all the rest of that. And all the debate and discussion concerning the various overtures was scheduled for the last day of General Assembly. On the first day of General Assembly, it was brought up by, I believe it was Rufus Burton, the stated clerk of New River Presbytery, that according to our printed docket, our provided packet, that the PJC did not share their findings concerning the clarity, the consistency, and the compatibility with the rest of the Constitution. They're what we call the 3 C's analysis. They did not share that in regards to New River's overture. And they also took it upon themselves to refer the overture to the Ministerial Vocation Committee. So this came up to become an issue which teaching elder Jeremiah would address, because The reason for this cited was the Acts of Assembly in the EPC part of the Book of Order, but not one of our constitutional parts. That allowed them to do that says that all business which comes to the floor of General Assembly must come there through a committee. And so when on the second day after the question and concern by Rufus to bring up the issue to get that constitutional test, made public, and to ensure that it would be brought to the floor, where he was overturned by the ruling of the chair, Jeff Jeremiah got up and charged the assembly with violating the Constitution of the EPC by giving deference to the Acts of Assembly over the requirements of the Book of Government in provision 21.3-B2.
So it's a well. Let's watch what he says there, and then you can make some more comments to help us understand it.
I am T.E. Jeff Jeremiah. I have been a member of the EPC for 37 years, serving as its stated clerk for 15 years. Yesterday, this is 2 minutes and 48 seconds. I have been a member. Yesterday, this assembly, at the urging of platform leadership, took an unprecedented action in the 44-year history of our church. We, the assembly, violated our own Constitution. Again, we, the assembly, violated our own Constitution. In addressing the point of order challenging the Permanent Judicial Commission's handling of the New River Overture in Recommendation 4436, the authority cited that justified that handling was Rules for Assembly 9.1, which says all business shall ordinarily come to the floor of the assembly for final action through standing committees. Rules for Assembly is not a part of the Constitution of the EPC. The Book of Government is a part of our Constitution. In handling overtures that propose an amendment to the Constitution, Book of Government 21-3D2A says, the stated clerk shall refer all such proposed amendments to the Permanent Judicial Commission, which shall examine the proposed amendment for clarity and consistency of language and for compatibility with the other provisions of the Constitution of the EPC. This citation, which has constitutional authority, was ignored. Instead, Rules of Assembly 9.1, which is not constitutional, was cited, effectively superseding and violating the Book of Government. This assembly violated our Constitution. I ask that this point of order be sustained by you, Mr. Moderator. If it is, I am prepared to offer a remedy.
Thank you for your point. It is not sustained.
Excuse me?
Thank you for your point. I do not sustain it.
I would like to appeal to the assembly to not approve the ruling of the moderator.
So what we have is a challenge to the authority of the chair. It's not debatable. We will have a vote to sustain my decision and go on and do business, or to overturn my decision. Do you understand what we're about to vote on? No. Okay, the chair is not sustained, so we will refer this matter to the Permanent Judicial Committee to reconsider. Jeff, I would invite you to attend that. It'll go back to the PJC.
I would like to propose a motion, Mr. Moderator, that I think remedies this issue, that I believe will receive the full support of the Assembly. I move that the 44th General Assembly remove Recommendation 4436 from consideration, and that the Permanent Judicial Commission convene to rule on the constitutionality of Recommendation 4437 in accordance with Book of Government 21.3D2A and B, and file its report to the Office of the General Assembly by 11 a.m. on Thursday, June the 20th. Mr. Moderator, I believe you received this by email. With a second, I would like to speak very briefly to the motion. Given the defective authority upon which it was based, the best way to address Recommendation 4436 is to simply make it go away. This motion does that. By convening and ruling on the constitutionality of Recommendation 4437, the Permanent Judicial Commission fulfills its constitutional responsibility of doing the 3C test: clarity, compatibility, consistency with the Constitution, and in reporting it.
So there's what happened. I had to cut and splice. It took about 20 minutes to get through that point of order and challenge to the chair. It was interesting how how many people in that little 20-minute segment seem not to know what a point of personal privilege is. There was no complaint about the volume or the temperature of the room, but that's maybe just a pet peeve of mine. Uh,
And
but
mine.
and yes, but
He is
what
wrong.
what Mr. Jeremiah was articulating is that the PJC, the Judicial Committee, didn't fulfill its constitutional mandate, and there was some back and forth on that. People can go back and watch this. Maybe I'll put the link to the full discussion and even debate over the challenge to the chair, which the parliamentarian eventually got up and said, "Look, you can't debate a challenge to the chair." It would be a healthy thing for people to watch to see. How the church enforces her rules of assembly operations. But the crux of Mr. Jeremiah's argument was that the assembly was not following its own constitution. Do I understand that correctly? That the Judicial Committee needs to evaluate every overture based on those three C's,
Mm-hmm.
but they failed to do that. And so he said, let's bring it back under regular order. But
Yes.
the chair, the moderator, was saying, no, we're going to follow the docket. If you sustain the chair, all this is doing is following the docket. So it was a curious way of framing the question, or maybe I just misunderstood. Can you help me understand that better?
So there's a couple of things going on here. First off, in the Book of Government, the duty of the Permanent Judicial Commission as regards amendments to the Constitution is to make that test, to test it for the clarity, consistency, and compatibility. In what was provided to the Assembly in our docket was no evidence of that having been done. Yeah, if there's no pictures, it didn't happen. They said that they did it, but in part of where you edited out, it was stated that or suggested that they weren't obligated to provide that information. But my reading of English is that at 21.3D2B, the Permanent Judicial Commission shall report its findings to the General Assembly along with its recommendations. Shall says we should be receiving that test, the report of that test.
We must receive it. They must do this. Shall is
Correct.
not optional. Should would be, right? You should do this,
Right.
but
And so, if in the background, where they eventually ruled formally by the next day, after the passage of the motion that you just saw Jeff Jeremiah make, when they ruled that it was out of conformity, that it was not compatible or consistent with the rest of the Constitution, the same point in the Book of Order goes on to say that they may include an amended version of the proposed constitutional changes. So they could have offered a perfected motion as a substitute, but they didn't. And they weren't obligated to offer a perfected motion, but they could have. The second issue that was going on here substantively is that as part of the referenced motion that was at discussion, the Permanent Judicial Commission was referring the New River Overture to the Ministerial Vocation Committee, which is a standing committee, but that goes beyond the stated authority and responsibility and purview of the PJC. The body could have referred it to the committee, or even perhaps, but the commission itself could not. That goes beyond its given authority, because the Book of Government for the EPC is supposed to be regulative. They can only do what they are told they can do. And so they were claiming authority that didn't rightly belong to them. And that was the second part that was bringing up the challenge.
I see. And remarkably, especially for a denomination that is more nice and goes along with decent, they sustained the challenge to the chair. I mean, that rarely happens in the PCA, and we love to fight it out.
consider who brought the challenge to the chair. It was their stated
Previous
clerk of
stated
15 years. Yeah, I mean, Jeff Jeremiah has a great deal of influence, and I think he probably wields it judiciously and doesn't spend his capital willy-nilly. And the way he was talking, even the way he was handling the papers, it was very clear that he was agitated with what we might call a righteous agitation, if not a righteous indignation about what had transpired the previous day.
Yeah, absolutely. That was very well done. So
Kind of reminded me of you when you get up and speak at PCA General Assembly, Ryan.
well, he can reach the microphone.
Yeah.
I usually have to get a box to stand on to get up to that microphone.
Get a
So,
floor clerk to install one there for you.
Yeah, really. We need maybe I won't have to speak this year.
Yeah, right.
So somehow we got from this, considering this proposal to the EPC General Assembly to be added to your Constitution, to a study committee. How did that happen? And I think you spoke to that issue.
So I did. Let's not roll that tape yet.
No, I want to see it.
We'll get there. But to get to that point, after the passage of Jeff's motion there, that technically cleared the way for the New River Overture to come directly to the floor. But the commission met, made their ruling, and determined that it was out of order entirely, over, that afternoon. And so that was reported at the business of the next day.
Is that the one that was by one vote?
What's that?
Was that the one that they decided was out of order, but with a margin of one vote?
I believe so.
Okay.
But I'm not. My memory is not certain on that.
Ever since I've had COVID, I can't remember anything.
And so the next day, the third day of business is when all the different standing committees would meet, right? Or maybe it was later on the second day. The committees met, and this compromise, which had been being worked on in the background between representatives of Mid-America Presbytery, which was the presbytery considering the reception of Johnson, and representatives from New River Presbytery, came together with this to create some kind of harmony to bring to the floor to try to make as many people happy and satisfied as possible and addressing all the issues. All of the related overtures connected to it, which had been brought after New River's initial, were all asking for some form of committee and answer from the General Assembly. And so the decision was ultimately to punt everything 2 years down the road and create a study committee in the meantime.
That's probably the most Presbyterian thing that the EPC has done out of everything we've discussed so far.
Yes. Yeah. With all of this here, it really was. There's a couple of things that are interesting about the overture that they put on up. But this is, the overture that eventually did pass.
Can you explain this to me, Joseph? The final, the final resolution of the question that was passed is, be it further resolved that it is the opinion and wish of the 44th GA that no presbytery shall take action on petitions or matters that might touch on the inquiry until the final report is received and acted upon by the 46th GA. What does this mean? It's the opinion, it's the wish of the assembly.
Bro, it means exactly what it says. That's a whole crock of equivocation and hedging language. I mean, there's no force or teeth in that at all. And the fact that they threw in a shall is just completely confusing.
It is. It is very confusing. And my opinion,
you have an opinion. The assembly has an opinion.
I have an opinion too. You don't want to hear my opinion.
In reading our polity for this, and listening to the conversation that happens up on stage during part of the discussion here between the moderator and the stated clerk, that this was kind of a way to put in writing a gentleman's agreement, and warning people against going against the wish and will of the General Assembly, which, as far as I'm aware, in EPC polity, there is no governance concerning gentlemen's agreements and
Well, I mean,
no
you got
binding
late
authority on them.
on this
But the
committee. You got
effect,
Yeah, you got Pastor Shelley and Elder
Pastor
Carroll
Sandy
here.
and Pastor
No,
Carroll.
Sandy Wilson's a dude.
Okay, well, you still got, yeah. How do you have a gentleman's agreement when you got ladies and guys? So
My wife,
that's
for
another
example,
oddity.
my wife does not like gentlemen's agreements. She's like, hey, tell me what's gonna happen. Don't tell me what your opinion and wish is. Just tell me what are we doing. And so maybe you should have listened to the ladies here, because I'm sure they would have told you, hey, let's get this pinned down, guys. Come on.
But the
man up.
effect of that part, that really strange statement, has the effect of binding the consciences of the presbyteries, which
Does
it
it,
really
though?
should. It has the practical effect of it, because people are giving it that authority of binding the conscience to not send up overtures, as was commonly happening in the PCA, to not even, really to not take any action.
And this would include
Presbytery.
not take action to bring Memorial Pres into Mid-America Presbytery, right?
That was also a part of it, that Mid-America was agreeing that they would not bring in Mid-America or bring in Memorial or Greg Johnson during this period. Nobody else would bring in somebody who would be subscribing to his same brand of theology, and nobody would be taking any actions to further refine, bring clarity to the Book of Government about this issue until after the committee had done its work.
I want to say something on this, and I know there have been times in the PCA and other denominations that similar arrangements and agreements were kind of struck, but again, going back to Acts 14:15, it is the inalienable right, the God-given right of lower courts to be able to petition or overture higher courts for help to address things. And what this effectively does is take away that biblical God-given right of the lower court, and to abrogate that biblical God-given responsibility of the higher court for a definite period of 2 years. And it's not helpful. I think that I understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to bring the temperature down in the room, to bring a measure of calm so they can get through other business for a couple of years and not have this just drive everybody into a frenzy. But if you followed procedure properly and you were able to handle deliberation, without having to consult with a parliamentarian about what it means to challenge a chair or whatever, then you'd be able to get through your business and handle important matters like this decently and in good order. So this whole thing just smacks of tyranny to me. Maybe I'm speaking too strongly. What do you think, Ryan?
Well, I find it all very curious that, as you say, it's my right, in the PCA at least, it's my right as a member of the PCA and as an officer to send up, as we saw last year, I could send up an overture to General Assembly, and the Assembly must consider it unless Howie Donahoe or Fred Greco revise our Rules of Assembly operation with the consent of the body. But here, what you're saying, the effect of this is that you can't even, your presbytery, your session couldn't send up an overture to a broader court on this issue for 2 years?
Correct. I do not believe that under EPC polity that a session or an individual teaching or ruling elder can submit an overture directly to the General Assembly. I think it does have to go through the presbytery, but I'm not 100% certain on that.
Well, and even in
But
the PCA, I could submit it to my presbytery. If my presbytery votes it down, I can still take it to our broadest court,
right.
and they can vote it up. And this year, for the first time, I think in PCA polity history, a personal resolution was adopted by the assembly and requires two, not one, but two of our permanent committees to do something, to produce a report.
So
So
what
that,
this has the effect of doing, though, in my opinion, and from what I grew up in, is this smells of the PCUSA machinations of things. Because while presbyteries are warned and cautioned, you can't do anything, during this time. You can't
oh,
say
really?
anything up, but that doesn't stop the anybody else from saying or doing anything over that time who would be in the Office of General Assembly, the National Leadership Team, local presbyteries. You've got 2 years where if people were so inclined to get supportive individuals into committee roles through nominations, there's a lot of politicking that is allowable in the background through all of this to create a favorable circumstance for whatever the leadership is deciding. Zach, as you said, this feels like tyranny, and that's what fundamentally drove my congregation out, is that there has developed this sense of hierarchialism in the EPC where it is not being driven from the bottom up, but things are being decided and run from on high.
Mm. Well, that's a good transition point then. Your congregation, as well as you yourself personally, are petitioning the Ohio Presbytery for membership. So my first question is that there are some people, some who may even listen to this podcast, who do not believe that Ohio exists. What would you say to those people?
Well, I've never actually heard that allegation happen, but I am confident that it does exist. As a native-born Floridian, I know that records of it exist because I saw a lot of Ohio license plates,
Okay.
and no, they did not move down south and forget how to drive, especially in the rain. They just don't know how to drive up here to
So
begin with.
so you would say, are you from
Ohio's
Miami?
rough, man. Ohio's rough. From
I agree.
Miami to Miami Valley. Boom, boom.
Okay, well, so some people you're not going to convince, but
Yep,
you are there in Ohio right now.
yep.
Okay, so either you're AI or Ohio does exist.
So
So
being from Philadelphia, do you know what I call Pittsburgh? Ohio. Anything basically west of Gettysburg is Ohio.
I saw a meme the other day that's had Ohio on there, then Lower Ohio, Northern, covering up the rest of the U.S. and Canada. But
Abomination.
and also hearing that suddenly Ohio is a curse word or a negative slang in some sort of regards. I don't get it.
In across the Southland, yes, that's absolutely the case, and with
I
good
don't
reason.
understand it.
Well,
yeah,
It's really not that bad here.
you got to go back like 150 years, and then maybe you'll understand it.
Well, I lived in Atlanta for 5 years. Was there for pre-middle school, so
Oh,
I
cool.
know that there is no love lost on Ohio, and it was very challenging coming here because Mansfield is the hometown of Sherman.
we don't use that word on
Yeah,
this podcast. So
we're all Yankees, though, aren't we? Yeah, we are. It's all right.
so
Whatever.
your congregation is responding to the potential uh, change of what seems to what you have perceived as
Yes.
happening in the EPC, and they've said, you know what, we don't like where it's going. We don't like what we're seeing, so we're gonna. You're an independent congregation right now. And how has that gone? Because the PCA, there's much less feminism in the PCA than the EPC. So I don't know if you had any lady elders. How are they taking the prospect that we would have to affirm that this was not a lawful ordination. Is that not?
So making the change,
Yes.
a couple of things throughout the process. The stated clerk of our session is a woman. She has served as the stated clerk for decades. She knows where all the bodies are buried. Wonderful woman. And we've also had another female ruling elder serving presently. When the decision to leave the EPC was coming up, and the likelihood of recommending PCA was becoming greater and greater. We've not actually made the recommendation formally yet. So the congregation has not yet petitioned the presbytery to come in. But they both said that the issue of homosexuals being ordained is a more important and a stronger concern than the idea of women's ordination.
Wow.
They would gladly step aside, to put us where we don't have to deal with those issues, because they went through all of that with the PCUSA before. They've been down this road before. They know where it ends, and they don't want to do it again. And so they will gladly step aside in favor of that, because there are things that are more important. When I accepted the call to this congregation 4 years ago, one of the things I learned shortly after was their PNC would not consider any women teaching elders as an option. They did have women ruling elders, but all of the women who were serving on session at the time affirmed to me that they would have preferred that the men were doing it.
Amen.
So the best
Good for
I could
them.
describe things was this congregation has been egalitarian by necessity, by not having enough qualified, capable, and willing men to step up and serve. And over the past 4 years, that is a situation that has changed.
Great.
So
Praise
it has
God.
shifted. We have some very good, qualified, smart, theologically astute men, and I am very hopeful for our future with that.
Excellent.
So when we do make the recommendation formally, I don't expect there to be too much difficulty or trauma. I've had one or two congregants come to me saying that, well, they're Presbyterian because they ordain women, thinking long back from mainline days. But by and large, I don't expect a big negative impact.
That's wonderful. So the people who were saying they were Presbyterian because they ordained women, they're not officers, though.
Correct.
Oh, that's interesting.
They're just members of the congregation.
The general office. So, as you see it, you have described yourself as a strict subscriptionist. How would you distinguish the view of subscription in the PCA from the EPC?
So the EPC would probably affirm itself as well as being a good faith subscriptionist. Technically, the EPC holds to the confessions the same way that the PCA does. Technically, in practice and effect, I would strongly disagree. When I transferred on in, I was, when I was having my meetings with the ministerial committee, I did not want to take any exceptions, and I ended up not. But they were the ones actively encouraging me to take an exception to 21.8 and Larger Catechism 109. They were suggesting that I take those. And almost every candidate I've heard who came into the presbytery after me, 9 out of 10 would take 21.8 at the very least.
Yep.
I think that's part of fear of legalism, but because I became known as a troublemaker in pain because I would ask every candidate, why they would be taking that, and I would always abstain in the voting because I know it's going to pass, but I'm not going to confidently affirm it, but I'm also not going to negate them for something that is permissible.
Sure, sure.
But for them, uh, almost everyone argues that it's because of how we understand recreation now versus then.
Yeah, we know. We've
And
heard it.
so it's, I want to be able to play ball with my kids and be able to do things. And I don't think that's what recreation
No.
means. And my personal opinion is that there's only two reasons to try and claim an exception from the Westminster Standards. And that's either, pardon me for the office line, somebody was ringing, either because you believe that the Westminster Divines were wrong, and then the effort is on you to prove them wrong, or you're being honest and saying, I don't want to be held accountable to these standards. And if somebody gave those answers, I would accept that, and I would probably actually approve them for it if they were being that kind of honest. But I think that the whole idea of taking exceptions to the standards, the latitudinarianism, has been the fundamental problem with every Presbyterian denomination in American history.
Yep.
It has been the root cause of everything. Even Jonathan Edwards, his dad and his sisters all went to Harvard. His dad was a Harvard man and sent him to Yale because Harvard was adopting latitudinarianism.
Yeah.
So
And-
the problem,
was a little-
as soon as you start cherry picking and picking and choosing what you're going to allow and not, you got problems. And so you asked about what's the difference between the attitude in the EPC and PCA. My understanding of the PCA is you really are asking permission to allow yourself to, be out of conformity, with on these things, but the PCA is still affirming those as true. In the EPC, it's more taken for granted that if you ask, you will be granted it, no matter what. And further on, after a pastor, a teaching elder is received and ordained, the confessions no longer substantively matter.
Mm.
You
don't use them in your ministry, is what you're saying.
They don't get. Maybe individual pastors will use them for a study or something in their congregations, but they are not an important part of the life and ethos of the church.
They're not your philosophy of ministry.
To help us make decisions at the presbytery level. It's once you affirm it, great, and now we can forget about it. So long as it boils down to a sense of lowest common denominator egalitarianism. If you can affirm tulip and you like the five solas, you're good enough for us, as if that was the be-all, end-all of Reformed theology.
And it's probably helpful if you have like a Commonwealth accent in Scottish or Irish or English or Australian. That always goes a long way with Presbyterians. And if you wear a kilt, you get extra points.
I do wear a kilt, but that gets you usually into the ARP.
Do you wear? Wait, do you wear a kilt like all the time, or just at General Assembly, or what?
I actually generally wear a kilt on Fridays as a norm. I'm not today.
Okay, I was going to say, please don't stand
20
up.
degrees outside. I don't have a need to freeze my knees.
So
but,
some people have casual
General Assembly, and we also do on Reformation Sunday have a traditional Scottish Presbyterian service as a Kirkin of the Tartans.
Yeah, sure. Oh, so whereas most people have casual Fridays, you have kilted Fridays.
Yes.
Kilted Fridays. All right. Well, let me one last question before we break up. Why did you decide then the PCA instead of the ARP, which apparently loves kilts, or the OPC, which decidedly loves not kilts?
They do love solid color shirts though, like bright red, orange, maybe with like green and purple ties in combo. I see that a lot. Sometimes black shirts with white ties.
Diversity.
Yeah, it's
so
very.
Why the PCA?
It's impressive.
Well, there's a lot of good things about the other denominations, and myself personally, I could fit well with many of them. With everybody to the right, anybody who's an APARC, I could probably get along in myself.
Yeah, I see that.
But the ARP, they geography, because they don't have anything near here in Ohio,
Yeah.
so it's not practical for this congregation. And furthermore, when you look at all the issues they've had with Second Pres this year, um, you know, when we're leaving the EPC because of polity related abuses, we're not going to walk into that kind of a situation. The OPC, I've had several OPC pastors during seminary. I've got several friends who are, but so I'm quite familiar with the culture in there and the ivory tower, high educated, strong readership in desire to be knowing confessions and reading the Puritans, and that culture and ethos would not suit my congregation. And the nail in the coffin really is the OPC still has a trust clause where property is owned by the denomination held in trust. And so, since the congregation left the PCUSA, had to buy and fight their way out, would
Yeah.
not lead them back into that situation. Our PCNA was, it has been a choice. They do have some in Ohio, and we're not that far from them there in Pittsburgh. But
You have to give up your hymn book.
we have exclusive psalmody and a cappella only, and we have a building with, I think, 5 pianos, and we also have 3 organs. Don't get to play them very often, but 3 organs in the building.
Seems extraneous.
That would be an impossible sell. And so, frankly, the PCA at the end of the day causes the fewest changes for us. No changes to our worship. We have the one substantive change of losing the ordination of women. And frankly, you guys have gone through this homosexual issue and have fought against it successfully and are finishing things up, but really working to put the issue to bed. And so it's not, we've left 2 denominations because of issues related to it. We don't want to leave a third.
Don't want to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's so you've made the negative and the positive case for
Yeah.
why to join the PCA, and we appreciate that. Well, Zach Groff and Joseph Yerger, thank you both for being part of the program and sharing your experiences.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. It was
Glad to
really
be here.
great to get to know you. Glad to have you on your way to the PCA. If there's anything we could do to help, please let us know. And if you're listening out there and you're in the EPC and you're like Joseph and like Mansfield First Presbyterian Church and you are frustrated with these trends that you're seeing in the EPC and you think you'd be a good fit for the PCA, reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you. And I'm confident that that you will find us not to be the big meanies that we're said to be. Don't believe the hype. The PCA is not a mean place. We are very winsome, right,
That's
Ryan?
right. That's right.
That's right.
And if you're too short to reach the microphone at the EPC, come to the PCA. We'll get you a box to stand on.
Yep. Ryan brings it.
All right. Thanks, brothers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining the conversation on the Westminster Standard, which is the podcast of Jude 3. For more information or to support our work at promoting confessional renewal within the Presbyterian Church in America, please visit our website, jude3pca.org. We rejoice that just this past week, one EPC congregation and her minister were received into the Ohio Presbytery, according to social media posts from Ohio. So this is perhaps start of a trend where we will see increasing confessional concern throughout North America and the Presbyterian Reformed community. Join us again next time. I'll talk to you then.